My favorite book of all time, A Dance with Dragons, just turned 14 years old last weekend. That means we've been waiting for the Winds of Winter for 14 years. And in that time, we've received a variety of updates from George R.R. Martin. While those updates have grown fewer and further between over the past several years, we've received a number of instances of Martin talking about specifically what he is working on, not just, oh yes, I'm writing, it's going pretty well, but specific work as to what he is doing in terms of what characters he is writing for at any given specific point. Today, I want to go through what Martin has said so far. Specifically, I'd like to examine all of the chapters of the Winds of Winter that we currently know exist or are planned to exist, as it's a very interesting thing to examine, as it can kind of give insight into where the stories of some characters might be going, given the fact that we know a lot about some characters and next to nothing about others. Before delving in, I find it worthwhile to examine the terminology that I'm going to use throughout this video. There are three kind of tiers to chapters that I'm going to be discussing here. The first and highest of these are sample chapters. These are full bodies of text that were posted somewhere, be it George's website or other sources, or in the back of certain editions of A Dance with Dragons. These are like the full text of a chapter, everything that version of a chapter is, full punctuation, wording, emphasis, italics on everything. A step down from that are con readings. As the name would imply, these are chapters that George R.R. Martin has read at a convention of some sort. Con readings are a lot more variable in quality. In the best case, we have a full recording of a chapter. In other cases, we have a recording of part of a chapter. And in other cases still, we only have some fan reports. The last rung on the ladder is the chapters that Martin has just made reference to over the years. Those references can be as vague as saying, oh, I'm writing for such and such character this month. Or they can be more in-depth in saying that, oh, this chapter was intended to do such and such, and I am currently writing it. So all of these are varying levels and give us varying amounts of information about both the text and the characters. It is worth noting that the first two types of chapter have sort of run dry over the past almost decade. The last sample chapter was released on George R.R. Martin's blog in 2016, that being Arianne 2, and the last convention reading was around that same time. In both instances, Martin has cited the idea that he is reading too much of this book and doesn't want to give the entirety of the game away, as between all of the chapters read at conventions and released in samples, we do have probably over 100 pages of The Winds of Winter out already. With that said, Martin is going to a bunch of conventions later this year, so I don't know, maybe we could hope for another sample chapter or con reading, maybe? We'll see. I'm just biased because I'll be at NYCC, where Martin will also be, so it'd be cool if he reads one there. From here on in, I want to go character by character, or at least plotline by plotline, and examine what exactly we know about each character's chapters and stories so far. And let me know in the comments which characters and chapters you're looking forward to the most in The Winds of Winter, or what your favorite of the samples is. Tyrion Lannister is a very interesting case. He's the only character we know to be complete in The Winds of Winter. All of Tyrion's chapters are or were done. I think they probably are still done. Martin tends to lock material in, but he obviously can go back and change and edit things. Going to the material that we know for certain, we have two Tyrion chapters that have been either read or released as samples. Tyrion 2 was released as a full sample on the World of Ice and Fire app back in 2013 when I was in middle school. It was then taken down, but the text of it still exists online. I will link in the description to a resource where you can read 9 of these released chapters, but Tyrion 1 is a bit more interesting. The first chapter of The Half Man was read at a convention once and never again, apparently. So we have some fan notes and transcripts of parts of this chapter, but really not a ton of it. But Tyrion's second chapter in The Winds of Winter, we have the full text of. So it's really weird, and these two chapters, in my opinion, seem to cover kind of the same ground, so I could very much see them being combined in the future. But going forward into the future, in 2022, we heard on a Game of Thrones interview that George R.R. Martin only had one Tyrion chapter left to finish his arc in The Winds of Winter. He then talked about writing another Tyrion chapter on his blog after that, and we later heard, when he was on Stephen Colbert, that he has finished characters' arcs in The Winds of Winter, which has led to the thought that Tyrion's arc is complete. There's another character in an almost identical boat to Tyrion, that being Barristan Selmy. Both are involved at the Battle of Fire, and both have one officially fully released sample chapter. Barristan 1, The Winds of Winter, comes in the back of many US paperback copies of A Dance with Dragons. My main copy has that chapter in the back, yours might as well. Barristan 2 is in a similar boat to Tyrion 1. It's been read several times at conventions, but we really don't have any information further than that. We have fan reports, and it is interesting to see kind of the variations therein. For both the Tyrion sample chapter that hasn't been fully released and the Barristan chapter, I would recommend checking out YouTuber Preston Jacobs' Prepping for Winter series. He does a great job kind of analyzing the fan reports and really compiling all of the information we have into a single spot so you can actually learn about what is happening in that instance. But both Tyrion's and Barristan's chapters all revolve around the Battle of Fire. And I would also guess that Martin is probably done with Barristan in the Winds of Winter, because I think Barristan will probably die in the Battle of Fire. There is one very surprising character who beats out Tyrion and Barristan in terms of released material for the Winds of Winter, that being one Princess Arianne Martell, as she has two officially published sample chapters, both of which were released at different points on George R.R. Martin's website. Throughout these chapters, she is traveling from Dorne up through the Stormlands in order to eventually meet and treat with Aegon Targaryen. We have directly heard from Martin that there was a third Arianne chapter that was at least partially written at some point in time around the publication of A Dance with Dragons, as Arianne's chapters that we now have as samples were initially intended for the previous book in the series. Martin goes in depth on this on his blog, but in an earlier draft version of A Dance with Dragons, Aegon's invasion of Westeros was shifted from near the end of the book to the late middle of the book, and Aegon landing, Martin thought, would very much provoke a Dornish reaction, and thus we would need some Arianne chapters in A Dance with Dragons. But this invasion ended up getting pushed back to add more material to the middle, and thus Arianne's chapters were shifted into the Winds of Winter. Arriving now at our first character with tragically no sample chapters, we have Jon Connington, who I feel compelled to mention now for no biased reason, but for the fact that we know he has chapters in the Winds of Winter because of Arianne Martell. Specifically, Martin noted that he had a partially written complementary chapter between Arianne 2 and Arianne 3 written in 2010. So we had a partially written Jon Connington chapter in 2010 that was not released. So somewhere in a vault, there is another Jon Connington chapter that I will find someday. But regardless of that, it is worth noting that he is 100% the complementary point of view, as Arianne's first two chapters are all about going to the Stormlands to treat with Aegon, and the only character there who is a viewpoint is Jon Connington. We also hear that initially Martin did not want to show this Battle of Storm's End in the Winds of Winter on page, but he did change his mind about that, and that will likely take up the early part of Jon Connington's story in the Winds of Winter. I could see Jon Con 1 being complementary to Arianne 2, showing how his forces took Storm's End, potentially by guile, potentially by battle, but I don't know. If it's a battle chapter, it could be fun to read at a convention sometime. I don't know. All I'm saying. Arya is an interesting case. She's one of the few characters other than Tyrion that we know has a lot of material already written for the Winds of Winter at a fairly early point in development, as Martin has said that he has enough Arya chapters to fill a novella. One of those chapters is already released, the Mercy sample chapter, where Arya is working as a faceless man at the Bloody Hand play in Essos as she strikes another name off her list. But we know that there are more beyond that. In 2012, Martin sent a batch of Arya Wins chapters out to an artist who was having to make pictures of Bravos. And beyond that, we hear several references to Arya chapters later on in the 2020s even. Specifically, in 2020, June, Arya is going back to Westeros to kill someone, according to Martin saying so on his blog. And additionally, in August of 2020, Martin says that he is heading to Bravos to write another chapter. That has been interpreted by some to mean Arya. I could see that being Tyrion or Daenerys late in a journey over to Westeros, or maybe just another character coming back through Bravos full stop. But I think by that point, Arya is probably already back in Westeros with a lot of chapters. I'd say at least 5 or 6. The four Greyjoy viewpoints are all in fairly weird places in terms of what we know of their Winds of Winter chapters. Theon is the only one to have a fully published sample chapter. Beyond that, though, we really don't know much. Martin has not made any more references to writing for Theon, other than quote unquote revising a Theon chapter in 2016. Beyond that, we have the two Uncle Greyjoys, those being Aeron and Victarion. Aeron has The Forsaken, which is an incredible chapter, but contrary to popular belief, it was never released as a sample. Instead, we just have a transcript of it from Martin reading this chapter at a convention, and that transcript has been fully written down by fans, and it can be read as though it was a sample chapter. But it is worth noting we don't know any emphasis, punctuation, etc., but it is a very well done transcript. Additionally, Martin was at one point asked point blank whether The Forsaken was Aeron's only chapter. He said no. I'm inclined to believe that, and I think that Aeron will get maybe one more chapter, but I mean, what is Martin going to say? He's not going to confirm Aeron's death at some just interview or question and answer panel. Victarion is in a similar boat, pun intended. He has one kind of con-read chapter. Martin read half of a Victarion chapter at a convention way back in the 2010s. There's a recording of it. I would recommend you listen to it. It's great. It's really fun to listen to. And beyond that, we have heard reference to him writing for Victarion as recently as 2022. And beyond that, Asha is another weird case. She was referenced on Martin's blog as recently as May of this year, but we also don't have any fully published material. We do know that at a point Martin was working on an Asha chapter when he appeared on John Oliver last week tonight. As we can see it on his computer screen, it's referred to as the Asha fragment, but she has been one character that Martin references a lot as having chapters, but we haven't really seen anything to that effect. Cersei is another character we haven't had any material released for, but that makes sense. She's in a very politically sensitive area right now, and there are going to be a lot of events unfolding very, very early on in her story. But we know he was working on Cersei chapters in 2016, 2020, and 2022. Specifically, in the last of those, he says he finished a clutch of Cersei chapters that were giving him fits. So that says that Cersei was a character that probably has a fair few chapters in the Winds of Winter and has given Martin some trouble in the past, which he has previously had in terms of meeting up with other viewpoints or just dealing with very politically difficult circumstances, both of which seem pretty likely for Cersei in the Winds of Winter, as she is in the center of everything at King's Landing. Jaime and Brienne are also interesting. He's been pretty tight-lipped on those two, but he has said that he was wrestling with both of them around the same time he finished those Cersei chapters back in 2022. That implies to me that Jaime and Brienne's story is going to remain interlinked, at least throughout parts of the Winds of Winter, as when Martin is referenced writing one, he is referenced writing the other, and they are currently together as of the end of A Dance with Dragons. Moving back to two of the other Starks besides Arya, Bran has one mythical, fabled chapter that was cut from A Dance with Dragons and moved into the Winds of Winter, which makes sense as Bran vanishes as a viewpoint about halfway through A Dance with Dragons, and it's very strange, given that his third chapter is really great and very magical. It makes sense, though, given the fact that maybe he didn't want to overstuff these magical elements in one book, and maybe the Winds of Winter is going to pick back up with some of that. Beyond that, Bran has been continually referenced as one of the hardest characters for Martin to write, and while we haven't had direct references to him writing Bran chapters specifically, I think those references to Bran being very difficult to write can be taken as saying, yes, I've at least taken a crack at writing some Bran. Beyond that, Sansa we don't have a ton on, other than one officially released sample chapter, which is entitled Elaine 1, and was also originally intended for A Dance with Dragons, but ended up getting cut and moved to the Winds of Winter as it seemed more introductory than anything else, and could be good to start Sansa's story in the Winds of Winter, rather than just be sort of a random Sansa interlude in A Dance with Dragons. Martin has also referenced several characters as just being viewpoints in the Winds of Winter, including Arya Hotah and Melisandre of Asshai. Arya's story is pretty far removed from the rest of what's going on in Westeros and Essos, and I could see him not having a ton of chapters, so not talking about him a ton outside of just vague references every now and again does very much make sense. And Melisandre has been referenced as a viewpoint in terms of her thinking back to going back to Asshai as a place for her to visit in memory, given the fact that we're probably not going to get there in person in the main series. And I think that Martin has kept her chapters very under wraps, given the fact that we are going to have a lot going on at the Wall, and the fact that he doesn't want to reveal Jon's resurrection so soon. Sam has also only been referenced once since A Feast for Crows, which came out in 2005, and that was in a list with Melisandre and Victarion and other viewpoint characters that Martin's just kind of rattling off the cuff back in, I believe it was 2020. Sam is really kind of a ghost for the last, 20 years, and it makes me a little worried about his story going forward, which I've talked about in past videos as well, but he is also confirmed to be a viewpoint in Winds. Martin has also confirmed that there is going to be a prologue, and I don't necessarily think that needed confirmation, as every book in the series so far has had one, but it is worth noting that there is at least one more concrete detail on that chapter, that being that Jane Westerling will appear in it. She's not confirmed to be the viewpoint, that would be a death sentence, as every viewpoint from a prologue or epilogue has died in the series past. She will just appear, though that does narrow the narrative scope of this potential prologue to a pretty fair extent, given the fact that it can now pretty much exclusively take place in the Westerlands or the Riverlands, given the fact that those are the places where Jane Westerling has been in the recent past. We don't know if there will be an epilogue or not. There have been two in the series past. I did a video recently explaining what I thought the Winds of Winter epilogue could be. I tend to think that there will be an epilogue, but we'll see. There are several characters that Martin has sort of talked around for the Winds of Winter, likely to avoid any potential spoilers from slipping out about their arcs in the future of the series. A few of them are kind of weird picks for that specific role, and one of them is Sir Davos Seaworth. We've not heard any reference to Martin writing for Davos since A Dance with Dragons, which is completely nuts given that Davos vanishes a third of the way into that book, much like Bran Stark. But we do have some references that do kind of hint that Davos will be returning as a viewpoint character, most notably Martin talking about Rickon and Asha taking influences from the show, and the idea of unicorns and Skagos being seen in the Winds of Winter, all of which are things that Davos is currently headed towards as of his last chapter in A Dance with Dragons. Daenerys Targaryen is in the same boat, which surprised me initially back when I was first delving through Winds of Winter sample material a billion years ago. So, Daenerys ends A Dance with Dragons in the Dothraki Sea, having just gone through this kind of transformational inner journey, and she'll likely continue on with this Khalasar that picks her up at the end of this chapter. We've never seen direct reference to Martin writing for Dany as a viewpoint in the Winds of Winter. She was just mentioned on his blog in May of 2025, but that makes no mention of whether or not she is a viewpoint. He does specifically mention writing for the Dothraki back in 2012, and that likely means a Daenerys chapter. She'll probably be with the Dothraki for the first 2 to 3 chapters of her journey in the Winds of Winter, and I'd also bet they'll travel with her from these chapters going forward. And additionally, in an interview in 2014, Martin mentions writing a situation for Dany that he needs to figure out a way out of in the Winds of Winter, but it doesn't really go any further than that. And that's also not an explicit reference to her as a viewpoint, so he is being pretty careful there. Last but certainly not least, we have seen zero reference to Jon Snow as a viewpoint in the Winds of Winter, which makes sense as Jon Snow was bleeding out on the ground when we last saw him in A Dance with Dragons. I personally think this could be a sign that Jon might not return as a viewpoint character in the Winds of Winter, but overall it could just be seen as a way of not spoiling things, because, I mean, we all know that Jon's going to come back, but we don't know how, and the books are going to be different than the show, so Martin wants to kind of keep that veil in place. This has been kind of an interesting exercise. It does very much show that there are elements of the story that Martin is trying to keep more secret and less secret going into its future. We see the Battle of Fire up close and personal in 4 sample chapters, but the Battle of Ice is mostly shrouded in mystery, only being referenced in the Theon sample chapter in its prelude, and additionally in the Asha fragment, which was not intended to be released. We also have entire characters who are shrouded in mystery. We know a lot more about him working on Cersei as compared to him working on Daenerys. I think this speaks to these characters' overall trajectory in the Winds of Winter being maybe more unpredictable than some of us think, given the fact that Daenerys is so secretive right now and could have a different path than we anticipate. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments down below. Who do you think might have more chapters, less chapters, or fewer chapters? Sorry, Stannis. And I'll have many more videos for you on A Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, Dunk and Egg, Game of Thrones in the very near future. I appreciate any support. It is free to do. I also have a Patreon if you would prefer not free support, which I always forget to mention in videos. But yeah, thank you again for watching, and I will see you very soon. Goodbye, everyone.